obviously there's a big time thing going on over there in Ukraine right now. Russia is in there doing their worst. And what I want to do is try to explain to you what is happening over there in the best of my ability through my guest, Bob Hockett. He's always on with me and I'm always talking to him. He's the smartest guy I know. But let me just be clear. Bob Hockett is the lead dog at Cornell Law. I mean, this is a sharp guy that knows history, knows law, and he is the advisor to advisors. He's worked with Bernie Sanders. He's worked with AOC. He's worked with Elizabeth Warren. He's worked with just about everybody in Capitol Hill. You see him all over the place. He knows everybody, everything, and ultimately just an all-around brilliant man. Real quick, what I want to do, Bob, is just get everybody to understand that really, in my opinion anyway, right, there are no real good guys here. There's a lot of people with interests, and obviously Ukraine is one of the most resource-rich regions in the area that unfortunately never caught up with the rest of the world. They're almost like a global South country on so many levels. But you did a remarkable dissertation, if you will, explaining the history of the Ukraine situation. And I'd like for you to tell our audience, explain what's happening over there.
Yeah. No, what a joy to talk with you again, Stephen, and especially about this particular subject. There's a lot to be sort of recovered, a lot that people don't, I think, quite realize. So it's worth, I think, bringing it forward as you're wanting to do to kind of help provide a bit of context. So for one thing, Vladimir Putin is right that there is a long history of Russia and Ukraine kind of going or being together in one form or another. And the distinction between the two countries and cultures and languages is a bit less stark than some people think, right? The very first Russian state formation was in fact in Kiev way back when, over 1,000 years ago. And many Russians kind of trace the history of the Russian state and the ancestry of the Russian people as a separate people to that sort of early so-called Kievan Rus culture, which was a sort of a combination of Vikings from Sweden and local Slavic folk who all kind of came together when Viking traders kind of came down the Volga River from up north and sort of on their way to Byzantium sort of stopped and founded an empire right over in what is today Ukraine. After all of that, the territory that is now covered by the country of Ukraine was sort of roughly divided in half, with the western half of it being part of the Habsburg Empire, basically part of the Austro-Hungarian sort of formation on the one hand. And then the eastern part of the country was much more part of the Romanov Empire or the Russian Empire. And that is actually one of the reasons that you find a significant distinction between the opinions of those who live in the western and northern parts of modern-day Ukraine on the one hand, and those who live in the southern and eastern parts on the other. Those in the latter portion, in the southern and eastern parts, basically are very largely or primarily Russian speaking and oftentimes tend to be sort of Russian sympathizing and Russian leaning in their sort of orientations when it comes to sort of what countries they would like to be linked up with culturally and economically and the like. Those in the western half of the country, having been part of the Habsburg formation, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, speak more traditional Ukrainian itself, not simply Russian, and are a little bit more, I think, kind of cognizant of themselves as a distinct people, even if a related people to Russia. So all right from the get-go, right, the territory that is currently sort of demarcated Ukraine on the map is already, in a sense, significantly culturally divided. And so when Putin says some of the things that he says about the sort of historic connections between the peoples and the ancient Russian connections to, and even more modern or recent Russian connections to Ukraine, he's not wrong, at least about some parts of Ukraine, although some of his claims are perhaps a bit exaggerated if you're thinking in terms of Western Ukraine, sort of telescoping into the sort of contemporary period, or actually sort of maybe looking briefly at the Soviet period and then coming up to the current period. Ukraine was a very important part of the Soviet Union, of course. It was sort of the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It's also where an awful lot of the industrial capacities of the Soviet Union, which, as you know, were enormous, were among the most enormous in the world. A lot of those, or at least the greater part of Soviet industrial capacity, was concentrated in territory that is now considered to be Ukrainian. A great deal of the Russian or Soviet military, nuclear arsenal was based in Ukraine too, partly because of that industrial heritage and partly because that part is closer to Western Europe. And so it's a little sort of forward, sort of leaning forward, you might say, on the part of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. It made sense to have a good bit of it in Ukraine. But Ukraine also suffered a great deal during the Soviet period, partly at the hands of Stalin, right? A lot of the forcible sort of collectivization of agriculture took place there. Whether we view that collectivization as having been warranted or justified or not, it seems that many Ukrainians were sort of put out by it, and many apparently died during that period, during those struggles. And so we know
wasn't that the kulaks? I'm just trying to keep my history right. The
yeah,
kulaks, correct?
The
Keep going.
called the kulaks, who were essentially kind of small family farmers or sort of small peasant farmers who owned their own blocks of land. And my understanding
bourgeois farmers.
sort of, right? Yeah, maybe petty bourgeois farmers. And my understanding is that Stalin sort of took a look over to the West and looked in the United States where small family farms were being gobbled up by large agribusinesses, precisely because it was a more efficient way to organize agricultural production, and thought, well, we'll do the same thing over here, but instead of having it be, Cargill or some other private sector company that's kind of, again, swallowing up all these family farms that are being dispossessed after the Dust Bowl and during the Great Depression, we'll have the state do it. So basically, we collectivized agriculture at the same time that Stalin did. But of course, Stalin's collectivization is, of course, talked about as having been brutal, whereas the American collectivization isn't, because, of course, it was done by private sector entities. But in any event, however we look at that particular period, certainly plenty of Ukrainians were upset about it. And so a good many of them apparently welcomed the incoming Nazis when the Germans invaded in the summer of 1941. And for a while, there was a good bit of collaboration between at least some Ukrainians, particularly in the western half of the country, and the Germans, because they wanted to get rid of Stalin, and they thought anybody who will get rid of Stalin or get rid of the communist regime will be great. The problem for the Germans in all of that was they didn't seem to have any respect for the Ukrainians as a people any more than they had for the Russians as a people. They viewed them all as being lesser than the Aryans that the Germans claimed to be. And so before long, the Ukrainians realized that the Germans were no friends of theirs either. And so you had a lot more renewed sort of Ukrainian, Russian sort of collaboration or cooperation in driving out the Nazis. Then, of course, Ukraine was a very important part of the Soviet Union in the post-war era. And again, a lot of the sort of great industrial advances of the Soviet Union were done there. A lot of sort of modern energy plants were based there, of course, most notably Chernobyl. So you and I are both old enough to remember, even if we were rather youthful at the time, the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown and all the sort of horrors around that. That was all in Ukraine. But back in those days, they didn't describe it as Ukraine. They just said the Soviet Union, because it was all sort of lumped together. When the Soviet Union collapsed, right, at the end of the 80s, early 90s, of course, a lot of the former members of the Soviet Union decided to kind of go their own way to one degree or another and be sort of separate countries. And Ukraine was one of them. But precisely what role or what relation Ukraine would have in relation to the Russian Federation, which is another remaining country after the Soviet Union's demise, and what relation it might have to Europe, on the other hand, was sort of unsettled and sort of contested. On the other hand, the Russians believed that certain things were going to happen, and they had very good reason to believe that because they were assured that by the West. So, for one thing, you might remember that one of the conditions or one of the promises made by that first so-called President Bush, George H.W. Bush, to the Soviets and then to the Russians in return for their acquiescence to the reunification of Germany in 1989 was that NATO would never expand eastward. And as the Soviet Union then fell apart very shortly thereafter, again, these reassurances were continually repeated. That
we're famous for that, right?
Yeah, we're famous for that, right? The NATO alliance had been forged in the first place as a sort of anti-Soviet alliance, and it was created on the basis of the claim, however plausible, that Stalin was an imperialist and wanted to expand the Soviet Union ever westward, and therefore we had to sort of stand up to to Soviet westward expansionism and so forth. Well, if there wasn't going to be a Soviet Union any longer, it didn't really seem like there'd be much point in having a NATO any longer. And it certainly seemed that there would be no point in expanding NATO eastward. And so there were various promises made later in the sort of early 1990s as the Americans and other NATO members began to sort of talk about reneging on some of those promises. They sort of dangled before the Russians the prospect of Russian membership itself in NATO. And Yeltsin had shown some interest in that prospect, and Putin himself later showed some interest in that prospect. Another critical thing that happened during this period, you might remember, it was in 1994, Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin together convinced the then leader of Ukraine to relinquish voluntarily all of Ukraine's nuclear weapons, because when the Soviet Union fell apart, a huge part of its nuclear arsenal had been based in Ukraine, as mentioned before, and it was still there when there was no longer a Soviet Union, but there was a Ukraine and there was a Russia. And so Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin entered into a treaty with the president of Ukraine, and pursuant to this treaty, Ukraine would give up its nuclear weapons. And in return for that, both Russia and the United States would guarantee its territorial integrity, its sovereignty, its safety. That treaty, by the way, is still in force, but it's probably not a convenient thing for anybody in Washington to remember right now, because I don't think that they're in the mood to go and sort of protect Ukraine's sovereignty with troops. But in any event, things, of course, you remember a lot of things happened in rapid succession after that, all of which are kind of relevant to right now. So you remember in 1995, then war broke out in the former Yugoslavia. And originally it was between the Serbs and the Croats, but then later it was between the Serbs and the Bosnians as well. Now, interestingly, Croatia, the Croats and the Serbs are basically one people sort of ethnically and linguistically. They speak the same language, conveniently called Serbo-Croatian. The only real difference was that the Serbs had at one time had their own country called Serbia, which had been a Russian Empire client state, right? Indeed, Russian protection of Serbia against Austria-Hungary after the assassination of the Austrian Archduke by a Serbian nationalist is what brought us the First World War, right? So the Russians sort of thought of themselves as having an ancient role, a longstanding role as the sort of protectors of the Serbs, who were also Russian Orthodox. The Croats, by contrast, like the Austrians, were Roman Catholic, and so had tended to be sort of westward oriented. So, of course, when the war broke out in Yugoslavia, as you remember, Bill Clinton, again, our hero, of course, intervened and led NATO to intervene on behalf of Croatia, and so bombed Belgrade, bombed the Serbs. That made the Russians furious because, again, this had been their sort of traditional client, and they thought maybe there ought to be a more even-handed approach to whatever the squabbles are that are going on there. Yeah, so when the Russians kind of objected, Yeltsin in particular objected, Clinton and the West and NATO just kind of poo-pooed it, just kind of said, well, tough toenails, man. Then, of course, you remember in 1999, once again, U.S., NATO intervened against Serbia. Freudian slip there, against Serbia.
It's coming.
Right, yeah, it's coming up. On behalf, right, of Bosnia, and of, basically this was the Kosovo affair. Once again, Yeltsin sort of, shook his fist, was furious, was angry. But of course, the Americans just kind of brushed it off. Meanwhile, NATO kept expanding eastward, kept taking into its membership countries that had previously been not only parts of the Warsaw Pact, like Poland, for example, and the Czech Republic, but even parts of the Soviet Union, like the current Baltic republics, right? So, and of course, Yeltsin complained about that too, but they just ignored it. And things just kind of continued on that way, all the way into the early 2000s. You remember when George W. Bush, the next Bush, decided to invade Iraq unilaterally, essentially. The Russians objected to that too. They thought that maybe, this should be done more legally. The Americans just ignored them. George Bush just said, too bad. Around the same period, of course, early 2000s, George Bush decided unilaterally to abrogate the anti-ballistic missile treaty that Reagan had entered. And again, the Russians were upset and they complained, and Bush just brushed it off, just said, oh, that is so yesterday, man. We're not adversaries anymore. Don't worry. And so just one Russian concern after another was simply ignored. This, of course, led in significant measure, it wasn't the only cause, but it was an important cause in the coming to power of Vladimir Putin in the early 2000s, because Yeltsin was very widely viewed by the Russian people as a sort of a bungling weakling, because the West just kind of walked all over him and he couldn't do anything about it. So when, one of the things that Putin sort of ran on when he began to sort of move to power or toward power was that, look, it's time to restore a bit of respect for Russia and restore a bit of dignity and maybe sort of stand up to these Westerners. And Bush, of course, says, well, I could look into his soul. I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul, so no problem. But then, of course, 2008, what does Bush do? He invites Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. Now, that was a red line, to use our other fearless leader Obama's language, for Putin. And Putin actually acted on the red line. And you might remember, he invaded briefly the country of Georgia in 2008 in order to kind of send a signal, to kind of make it clear that no further, right? You're getting a little too close to Russia here with your NATO expansions. And this, of course, sent a signal to NATO and to the West and to Ukraine as well. And so they started sort of slow walking the idea of Ukraine's joining NATO.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.